Well, good morning. I always enjoy visiting Perth. It's an outward-looking, can-do business community, which, when combined with the state's natural resources, has created one of Australia's most successful economies. When I last spoke at CEDA, the Economic and Political Overview, it was actually back in Melbourne in 2011. I was asked to provide some thoughts on the impact of the minority government and what it meant for economic reform in Australia. I talked then about the need to create a nation which was much more deeply engaged with our future in Asia and able to make the most of the significant opportunity that the Asian century provides us in natural resources and in agriculture. I also talked then about the need to improve our competitiveness, particularly in manufacturing. 3 years on, we know that there is an enormous gap between the policies and reforms that Australia needed and what the minority government actually delivered. And today that gap has become even more urgent to address. The consequence is that we missed opportunities, and as we know, Australia's growth outlook is softer and our fiscal position significantly worse. Here in Western Australia, the resources boom did not reach its potential because, among other things, national policies to ease supply-side constraints were just not addressed. In fact, matters were made worse. Capital was frightened away from Australia by the resources tax fiasco, and labour challenges were made more difficult by policies that reduced the availability of much-needed foreign labour and expertise. In traditional industries like manufacturing, successive Australian governments have failed to address the major productivity challenge that Australia faces. In recent months, for example, this productivity challenge has been amongst the complex range of issues that contributed to decisions by Ford and General Motors to cease manufacturing here in Australia. These lost years of reform serve to support our most cynical view of politicians, that power is all that counts in politics. But as we've seen during the past decade, power without ideas leads only to improvisation. And it makes us recall the best of the Hawke, Keating and Howard years, which showed us that if there are big ideas that enable leaders to impose a direction on events, things actually move. Today, one of the issues that we'll be discussing is whether we can expect better outcomes from the Liberal coalition. Well, let me start by saying that the Abbott government has shown a willingness to listen to views and to ideas from business. Many of us in this room know from bitter experience during the Rudd-Gillard years that is a huge improvement, and this is an important and positive step that has been made by the government. This new environment of dialogue is why we've seen a more active contribution from business to the national policy discussion in recent months. And I would encourage the Prime Minister to foster this discussion, to build a consensus around the ideas that Australia needs to build a stronger economic future. We all need to remind ourselves of what can be achieved when Australia is led by politicians who think first about what benefits Australia in the longer term, rather than focusing primarily on the short-term election cycle. But a rapid shift from listening to acting is now urgent. Given the absence of meaningful economic reform over the past decade, and to be frank, by the fiscal mess created over the past few years, what is in store for us in 2014? Am I optimistic? Well, I think right now that the jury is still out. You heard a number of decisions that have been that Peter raised earlier, and another one that he didn't mention was the decision not to approve the ADM takeover of Graincorp, which I think was hard to understand. Australia's agricultural industries have huge potential in the Asian century, and we highlighted in a recent ANZ Insight report, we desperately need capital to realise this. Almost $600 billion of capital between now and 2050. As we've seen in the resources sector, foreign capital has a key role to play. But capital is a global resource, and it goes where it's welcome. On the other hand, it is pleasing to see the government championing trade liberalisation and to hear Prime Minister Abbott highlight the important role of business in driving economic growth. And there is also, as Peter mentioned earlier, the welcome appointment of a senior business leader in Tony Shepherd to chair the government's Commission of Audit, which is reviewing the size, scope, and indeed efficiency of government. But it does seem that the ground is being prepared so that we should not expect these numerous inquiries and reviews underway will result in any meaningful reforms until the next term of government. This expectation management reflects the current reality that Australian politics are now more polarised than ever. And also, let's not ignore that we have a coalition, which, whilst better than a minority government, means that the Liberal Party have to govern in partnership with the Nationals. And as we've seen, the two sides sometimes see the world quite differently. Within political parties, we are seeing diminishing numbers of reform-minded individuals. And even more worrying, we have seen the emergence of political parties and politicians whose views no longer describe the reality that we face, let alone have the capacity to change it. Regrettably, this is true of many Western economies, where the reform debate has stagnated in contrast to the approach of, say, a few key Asian economies, where reform has focused on driving economic growth and national prosperity. Let me say, though, that as a banker, I am actually optimistic by nature. And I think that we will actually be in a better position to assess what we can expect of the Abbott government after the May budget. In the meantime, what do I think that 2014 holds? I'm going to avoid predictions. I think a better way of looking at what is ahead is to focus on the key underlying force that is shaping our economic landscape. And although I think that much of the developed world is entering an era of diminished growth and diminished expectations, the outline that emerges for Australia is actually one of continued opportunity. And this opportunity is directly linked to the continuing redistribution of economic power to Asia, where the region will account for around 50% of global GDP by 2050, whilst the US and Europe will account for around 20%. Although China alone could account for a third of the world economy, it's important to remember that Asia is not just a story about China's growth. In fact, as recently as 2008, the ASEAN economies received only half as much foreign direct investment as China. 4 years later, in 2012, this gap had closed very significantly, with ASEAN attracting around $110 billion in FDI, compared to $120 billion in China. It highlights that the 10 ASEAN nations, including Indonesia, Malaysia, the Philippines, and Thailand, are going to play a key part in our future. And of course, there are also the non-ASEAN nations, India, South Korea, and a resurgent Japan. Together, this holds the promise of making a further 3 billion people affluent by today's standards. The result is that Asia will largely regain the dominant position in the global economic position that it actually held 250 years ago, before the Industrial Revolution. But despite Australia's proximity to Asia and our economic interdependence, with the notable exception of Western Australia, we seem to watch this transformation with a mixture of complacency and dispassion. Even now, the regular cycle of hard landing concerns about China persist amongst commentators. A recent headline in one of the daily papers said, "China growth in slow lane at 7.7%. Now, it is true that China's current growth rate of 7.5% does represent a slowdown from the 10% growth that was recorded from 1980 to 2010. And yes, there are concerns over excessive debt and related fears about the shadow banking system, worries about regional property bubbles, and the continued issue of overcapacity. But let me assure you, 7.5% growth in an economy the size of China is not in the slow lane. What is occurring is a rebalancing of the Chinese economy towards less export-driven, more service and consumption-based economy, something which just can't happen overnight. It will take strategy, it will take time, and it will take determination. And China has an ample supply of all three. And just in case you haven't been able to review the recent 21,500 word decision from China's third plenum, it basically covers 15 areas of reform. The key shift is the focus on China's much talked about pro-consumption structural rebalancing. This includes new language setting out a decisive role for the market in the Chinese economy, a change from the past when the market was assigned a basic role. It means that we will begin to see the reform of state-owned enterprises, financial reforms that will include greater exchange rate flexibility, and interest rate and capital account liberalisation. To allow for this structural transformation, China's growth is moderating with annual growth of between 7 to 8%, and perhaps closer to 7% in the next few years. This is actually good news. Greater reliance on services will support consumer demand and also allow China to move to a more sustainable growth trajectory. Far from being in the slow lane, annual growth of 7% will underpin demand for Australia's mineral and energy resources and create a major new opportunity in agriculture. It's worth noting that iron ore prices actually rose in 2013, averaging about $135 a tonne, compared to $128 in 2012. This happened at the same time as services became a larger proportion of Chinese GDP than manufacturing for the first time. The rebalancing is occurring while economic activity and commodity prices both remain healthy. Taking full advantage of the opportunities Australia has is not inevitable, though. We have been privileged in our ability to attract global capital for resources development, but countries in Africa, countries in Asia, and countries in South America are all working very hard to improve their positioning. These global competitors mean it's essential that we stop the cycle of complacency and disbelief and get on with urgent economic reforms we need to maximize the unique opportunity that is being created by the Asian century. I believe how we reorient our economy to maximize the Asian opportunity is the key foreign policy and key economic reform challenge for Australia. The required reform agenda needs much work and much discussion. Opportunities like this are rare, and with the lost decade of reform that we have already experienced, I believe government and business now need a much greater sense of conviction about Asia and a much greater sense of urgency around economic reform. Those of us in business need to support this progress and this whole process by engaging with the nation and with government, fostering an understanding of the new wave of reform that we need to drive growth and productivity. Many thanks for listening to me today.